Hello, welcome to Ignore the Machine. I'm Bradley J. My guest is Rich Rubino, who is a political commentator and historian, and we're going to talk about how lack of a Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives hurts the country, and what business does not get done, and why maybe this is things are the way they are, and perhaps some historical perspective on it. So, Rich, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me on again, Bradley.
Yeah. So, what's the status of the search for a speaker?
Well, Jim Jordan did not get the requisite 217 votes. You need 217 currently. There are 434 voting members of the House of Representatives. There are two vacancies. There are also delegates from the territories, but they don't have the authority to vote on speaker. They can vote in committee, but not on speaker, and certainly not on legislation. Right now, you have a scenario where tomorrow night there are going to be so far 8 candidates have declared they are running for speaker, and there's going to be a vote within the caucus. So candidates will go up and essentially present themselves, and then they're going to nominate somebody, and they're going to try this again with whoever wins that race is. Tom Amir is a congressman from Minnesota. He's the number 3 man in the House of Representatives on the Republican side, the majority whip. And part of the reason he's seen as a front runner is before becoming the whip, he was head of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee in the House. Now, why is that important? Well, because part of that job is essentially spending your time recruiting candidates and fundraising all over the country, trying essentially collecting chits from just about every candidate. Then they get elected and they're somewhat indebted to you. So now he's the whip. Now he can go to these members and say, I came out, I fundraised for you, I did this for you, I went to your district, I did this for you. Will you now vote for me for Speaker of the House? So that's why he's probably the front runner. But there are other candidates too. Byron Donalds, who's literally a sophomore member of Congress from Florida, is considered a major candidate. You have folks like Kevin Hern, who's the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, the largest committee in the House of Representatives. So you're really going to see a lot of members, and it's really be kind of a almost a battle royale to try to get a majority in the caucus, and then to go to the House of Representatives and try to get all but 4 members of the Republican Party, the majority party, to vote with them, which is really quite a tall task.
Do we have any reason to believe that the Freedom Caucus and the people who have been sticking the monkey wrench in the works will go along now with one of these speakers and not continue to be obstructionist?
I think that they actually will. First of all, Kevin Hern, if he's the nominee, he's chairman of the Republican Study Committee, which is pretty much tantamount to the Freedom Caucus. It's a group of very conservative members. Some are members of both. So I think he would potentially get support on the right. Byron Donalds has become kind of a folk hero on the right. He goes on a lot of shows, particularly sometimes liberal shows, and defends the Trump administration. Every member that's running so far, and this doesn't say there's not going to be more members, but every single member comes from solidly red congressional districts, and they know the only way they would ever lose their seat is in a primary, not in a general election. And most Freedom Caucus members, with a few exceptions like Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, also come from very conservative districts. So I think that there's very much some similarities there, and they see this person as somebody they can go back to their Republican constituents and say, I voted for a conservative for Speaker of the House. Theoretically, what could happen, and this is a very slim chance this actually could happen. You could have a very moderate Republican, say Dan Bacon from Nebraska, who comes from a district that went for Joe Biden last time. He could throw his hat in the ring for Speaker, get say 7 or 8 Republicans to vote for him, and then get the entire Democratic caucus to vote for him. So there would be a more moderate more moderate Speaker of the House. That theoretically could happen, but I think it's the more likely scenario is there's going to be a conservative, and they're going to basically get unified. The party's going to unify behind them. The one problem they probably do have, though, that conservative speaker, is there are currently 18 members who who are Republicans who represent congressional districts Joe Biden won. Many of them are in upstate New York, for example, and they do not want to have to go back home to their constituents and say they voted for a far right Speaker of the House, because you're going to see these advertisements the Democrats going to run. It's going to show a picture of that person, how far right that person says, and this congressman voted for that person. So that's really the problem they would be people on the left, not necessarily the Freedom Caucus or other people on the right wing of the Republican Party.
Will the person that gets nominated next be subject to the same restrictive rule that McCarthy was, the one that says anybody can bring up a vote of no confidence and you're out?
Pretty much. What the current rules are, and this is what got Kevin McCarthy out, is essentially it only takes one member to put up a motion to vacate the chair. and then they have another vote for speaker, and theoretically that person could win. So theoretically, one person could come up and say motion to vacate the chair, and they could have a vote, and that other person could essentially win every time. That didn't happen last time because while 96% of the Republican caucus voted for Kevin McCarthy, you had 8 Republicans who voted for somebody else, as well as the entire Democratic caucus, who was very much unified in voting for Hakeem Jeffries. And that could very well happen. That's why Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader from Kentucky, said that the one thing he thinks whoever the new speaker should be, the one thing he should try to propose is essentially extricating that from the House of Representatives, because you always have that scenario. One member comes up, it's a motion to vacate the chair, and you can keep going through this theoretically over and over and over again.
So is that a good thing even for the Republicans to have this rule where if one person brings up a motion to vacate, I mean, aren't they hamstrung by that? Isn't it bad for the party?
Oh, absolutely. But if you're a member like Matt Gaetz, the reason his purpose for being in Congress is not to be a functioning member of Congress, to bring largesse to his district, that type of thing, like most Republicans. He's not to be an appropriator. He's there essentially to do all he can to stop the House of Representatives from functioning unless you have the most conservative person as Speaker of the House. So for him, he'll go back to his constituents on the Florida Panhandle, and he'll be rewarded for what he did. And there are other members of the House of Representatives in the Freedom Caucus whose districts are so conservative, and their constituents are not interested in having a congressman there to be productive, to bring up legislation. They want a congressman who's essentially going to blow the House up, who's going to promote a conservative agenda. That's what they want. And for that purpose, Matt Gaetz really served a purpose for his own constituents.
Yeah, but what about being successful and pushing forward a conservative agenda? You need to compromise to do that. You need to work within the system and not just blow stuff up. Doesn't his district want to get the stuff you get when you're a functioning member, like businesses, like money, like things like that you don't get if you're just a bully in the sandbox?
There are two forms of conservatism. There's conservatism that's essentially you're a spoilsman or a spoilswoman. Yes, you're a conservative, but your main function when you get to Congress is to do everything you can for your district. You try to limit the federal government spending, but then when it comes down, like, for example, Ron Paul from Texas, most conservative member of Congress, he did everything he could to limit federal spending. But then once the budget was established, he tried to bring as many earmarks as home possible to his Lake Jackson, Texas congressional district. There are other Republicans, and a lot of them, if you listen to conservative talk radio, for example, and these are people usually from outside the district that will fund candidates who basically come in there and say essentially, government is way too big, government does way too much, we need to truncate the role of the federal government. And part of that is we need to have the most conservative Speaker of the House in there. And the fact that Kevin McCarthy negotiated a debt ceiling deal with Joe Biden, almost the Antichrist for many on the conservative right, is essentially that for someone like Matt Gaetz, for someone like his constituents, and for someone like who represents part of the Freedom Caucus, they say, okay, if he's going to be working with Joe Biden, we need somebody more conservative. They really do not want unless it's completely on their terms, they do not want compromise with the Democratic president. And you know what? Their districts are so conservative that their constituents don't want that either.
So don't his constituents suffer when the government shuts down, like it would have if Kevin McCarthy hadn't signed that deal, and lots of things get affected? Like, does Social Security get affected? Does Medicare get affected? Does pay to the military get affected? What else gets affected? They'd rather suffer personally like that than fund the government, to have the government.
It's interesting you say specifically pay for the military. That actually, pay for the military is one thing that will not be that will not necessarily be an issue. The military will still get paid, and actually
but they get paid only retroactively, though, right?
Right. But
so they're going to miss some paychecks while the government's closed. They'll get them back later.
They will still get that. They will still get. They're non-essential employees and essential employees, and the military is considered essential. There are others that are non-essential. That's why, for example, if you represent a congressional district in Fairfax County, for example, if you represent suburban Washington or Virginia or Maryland, that's where you have a lot of actual federal workers, and a lot of those will be deemed non-essential. Now, obviously, if you're working in a submarine, for example, that's something that is going to be essential, and they're not going to say, "Okay, let's bring the submarine to port now because the government's not being funded." So there is a difference. Congress, for example, during a government shutdown, they will still get paid because they, despite what the average Joe Bryan out there might say. I mean, that is somebody that is considered an essential employee, but there are others that are not, and obviously that is certainly a constituency. Federal workers, and there are many federal workers in that district in Florida. It actually has a lot of veterans, for example, that might have a job for the Department of Defense that might be deemed non-essential. But that's something that we actually have a little bit of time right now because of the deal that Kevin McCarthy made with Joe Biden, respectively. So between then and November, we do have a little bit of time to try to make a deal. But obviously, you're not going to make a deal unless, and this is where the people suffer, unless you have a sitting Speaker of the House.
All right, so these folks that just want a very diminished role in the government, the people who are willing to break the government, would rather break the government than have the government continue in a way that they don't like. They are also the people that really don't care at all about the fact that there was an attempt to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power. They don't like the government. They would like the government to be broken. They're happy about that, correct? They don't like the United States government. They want it broken.
For the most part. Now, there's obviously some exceptions to that. They do think the federal government. No, I don't think there's one member of Congress in the conservative right who would call themselves an anarchist, for example. If you ask them, do we need police? Do we need fire? They would say yes. And when it comes to reproductive rights, for example, do they think the government should declare human life at conception? Yes. They would say, we believe that's the role of the federal government to protect life, liberty, and property, or which eventually it was actually originally life, liberty, and estate. It came from John Locke, then it became property, and then it became the pursuit of happiness and the Declaration of Independence. But they do see some role for a federal government, certainly on social issues. But for the most part, many believe that the power should be essentially delegated more to the states and then back to the people, respectively. They look at the 9th and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. But in terms of the federal government's actual role, they think it should be extremely limited, almost to the point where it was prior to the Constitution under the Articles of Confederation, Perpetual Union.
So, is there any historical precedent for this amount of obstructionism? This is where your strong point. There probably is, right?
I guess so the first one I would say that's the closest to this historically would be back in 1910. In 1910, you had Joe Cannon from Illinois. And Joe Cannon was one of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives. And he was Speaker of the House, and he was almost omnipotent because what he did is he was not only Speaker, but he also made himself Chairman of the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee, which establishes what legislation is going to come to the floor, that type of a thing. So he had essentially dual powers. And there was a move by the Democrats and the Republicans at the time. There was a very redoubtable moderate wing of the Republican Party, or liberal wing. Believe it or not, there were liberal Republicans. And George Norris, a young congressman from Nebraska, essentially moved to extricate the Speaker of the House from the Rules Committee. He got 36 Republicans to vote with every solitary Democrat, and they got him off the Rules Committee. So Joe Cannon says, okay, if you're going to do that, why don't you do a motion to vacate the chair and try to get rid of me as well? So he did that. So there was a motion to vacate the chair, and that went nowhere. The Republicans would not allow Joe Cannon, who still had a lot of power, to leave the speakership. That's the only time there's ever been a motion to vacate the chair, and that was back in 1910. Joe Cannon ended up staying as Speaker. Then eventually in 1910, the Republicans lost control of the Congress, and and Joe Cannon could have gone back to becoming Minority Leader. Instead, he went back to his old job of being on the Appropriations Committee as a ranking Republican. A year later, he actually lost his own re-election bid. He barely won his own primary, then lost his own re-election bid. 2 years after that, he came back, won back in the House of Representatives, but he's still kind of a backbencher. And interestingly, in 1923, by the way, as a former member who was still in the House of Representatives, about 80 years old. He was actually on the front page of the first edition of Time magazine. That's a great trivia question for you. That's one example. But more recently, you had, I think, when Newt Gingrich came in, and Newt Gingrich in 1994, he had a new brand of conservatism. Bob Michael was kind of a go along to get along conservative. He worked with Tom Foley, the Democrat Speaker of the House. He worked with Democrats. He worked a little bit with Bill Clinton to try for example, in 93, 94. So Newt Gingrich in 1994 runs for Speaker of the House. Bob Michael claims that retiring. Because Newt Gingrich becomes the new face of the Republican Party, has his contract with America. He wins. Republicans take over this House for the first time since the days of Joe Martin literally for 40 years. And then by 1999, he was seen as spending too much time compromising with Bill Clinton. So what happens is in 1998, after the Republicans were supposed to take a huge lead a huge majority in the House of Representatives, he actually lost seats. The first time since 1820 that a president's party actually gained seats in a 6th year of a presidency. Bill Clinton did it in 1998. James Monroe did it in 1820. So what happened, there was a coup against him in the Republican Party. Dick Armey, who was a majority leader, seen as somebody who was an ally, was trying to get Congressman Bill Paxton to become Speaker of the House. They found out about this. It kind of blew up. But eventually Newt Gingrich had to resign resign as Speaker, resign his own seat. Fast forward to the days of John Boehner. When John Boehner was Speaker, he was seen as working too much with Barack Obama. So eventually he had to resign. And then of course you had Paul Ryan, who eventually did not run for re-election. And then you had Kevin McCarthy. So you're in times right now very similar contemporaneously, where whenever a Republican speaker seems to be working with the Democratic president, these members of the Freedom Caucus, who are in mostly congressional districts that are like 75% conservative, will do everything in their power to try to stop that from happening. And you saw kind of the climax of that, if you will, I guess the high or low watermark, depending on your perspective, when Kevin McCarthy became the first speaker to be ousted in the history of the Republic.
Okay, let me ask you some just isolated questions about other things that have gone on. Can I do that?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think that Biden helped the cause for funding Ukraine by tying it to defense for Israel?
Yes, I do, because when he gave a speech, and part of it was because where generally the American people are a war-weary republic after Afghanistan, after Iraq, very unpopular wars now. Ukraine was something that Republicans specifically were saying we need to cut off funding for Ukraine. There was kind of a battle royal in the party. Folks like Nikki Haley who said we should continue to fund it, and then folks on the right, like Matt Gaetz, for example, who were saying no, we shouldn't do this anymore. What he did, but when it comes to Israel, the Republican Party is pretty much homogenous in supporting funding for Israel. So Joe Biden tries to bring it together, say we need to support democracies, we need to support the Ukraine, and we need to support Israel. So we kind of brought these two together. The Ukraine is seen as a war that's more supported by Democrats. I think certainly funding Israel is unified on both parties, at least the center right and the center left. So politically, it was definitely a dexterous move for him.
Okay, Lauren Boebert.
Yes.
She just won by a hair in her district, right? So
Yep.
her recent behavior it's not great, right? That could spend her demise. That could spell her demise, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there are some voters that probably like what happened, and they're probably going to vote for her because there are probably some younger voters who maybe are very low propensity and might say, "Oh, I think she's hot. I'm going to vote for her." But for the most part, I think that's something that my guess is definitely going to hurt her. She comes from it's interesting. If you look at folks like the three amigos, I guess, Matt Gaetz, I say Gaetz because his name is really Gaetz, but people call it Gates. It's one of those confusion things. And Marjorie Taylor Greene come from overwhelmingly conservative districts. Lori Boebert does not. Her congressional district, on the one hand, goes western Colorado. You have Grand Junction and the environs around Grand Junction, Rock River conservative. But then you keep going down, eventually you get to places like Aspen, where you have very wealthy Democrats, and they're represented by Lori Boebert. So Lori Boebert, last time around in 2020, won by literally less than 1,000 votes, one of the closest elections in the country. And this time around in 2024, she is again up for a very close election. And obviously her opponent will try to do everything he possibly can to use this certainly against her. But, it's going to be one of those battles. If you get more, will there be more turnout with liberals in Aspen or conservatives in the environs and Grand Junction. It's a fascinating district because it's so bifurcated.
So did she, as part of that scene in the movie theater, pull the whole "Don't you know who I am" thing? Did she do that?
That's what people said in the movie theater. That she said, "Do you know who I am?" And then she said, "You'll be hearing from the mayor on Monday." The
So
mayor,
that's to me so gross, so bogus, so low life, so scummy to do that. That's so awful. But
yes,
so low, low, low scum to say, "Hey, don't you know who I am?"
not only
What a
that, but just from a political standpoint, um, when you're in office, you are not only there, you're not only on during the day, during a Monday through Friday, you're on all the time because no matter where you are,
yeah.
people are going to come up, and it comes with the territory. And members of the House of Representatives know this. It's very hard for you to come up to if a constituent comes and you're someplace, if you're at a hardware store and they start asking you questions, you better give them an answer because there's very possibility that if you're going to be rude to that person, someone's going to be there with a cell phone and that's going
Yeah.
to go all over. That's going to go viral. You are on when you're out of your house. You are on every single second. The idea that you can actually be a member of Congress and can actually give the finger to people that work in a movie theater and that you can
She
show.
gave the finger to somebody in the movie theater.
Oh yeah, when she was leaving, when they were leaving,
What a low life.
they were kicked up. She speaks well of you.
I'm embarrassed. I know she does. I know she loves me,
She
but
really does. You should get her on the program.
my relationship with her embarrasses me. I'm cutting
You need to get
ties.
her on next time.
No, no more. She's not ever coming on here again. Okay. She's never no she's not coming on, I should clarify to say.
Darn it. I would like to
Okay.
see that though.
Next, Kennedy.
Yes.
Kennedy's candidacy helps the Democrats, right?
I think it helps the
Because
Democrats.
more Republicans will vote for him.
Yes.
Correct?
Absolutely. And this is kind of a blessing for Joe Biden because the biggest fear they have is Cornel West, who's also running, and he's running to the left of Joe Biden, and they're afraid of votes that he could siphon off from the left. In terms of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he was running for the Democratic nomination, but a lot of his supporters were conservatives, were independents, or in some cases Republicans were going to cross over because he's somebody. His skepticism for vaccines, for example, his views on Ukraine, they're more in line with Republicans than they are Democrats. It's like what Joe Lieberman was in around 2005 when he was every Republican's favorite Democrat. So he's running as independent right now, and as soon as he announced his candidacy, the Donald Trump campaign, trepidatious of him, released essentially almost a dossier on him, talking about how liberal he used to be, to try to basically say, why would you vote for this guy? This guy's essentially far left. He's further left than Joe Biden, so they're going to do everything they possibly can to attack him. What's interesting about third parties in our country, though, major third party candidates, is they always have their high watermarks, but then as you get closer and closer to the election, that support generally recedes. John Anderson, if you remember 1980, for example, at some point was actually about 25%. He landed up winning 6.6% of the vote. As it got closer to the election, and people started to think this guy's not going to win, this is a wasted voter. They started to think, well, a vote for John Anderson is really a vote for somebody else. George Wallace, the same in '68. He was at about 25%. Going into early October of 1968, he landed up. Actually, this was the last time a candidate actually won electoral votes. He won 46, all from deep southern states, and then one outer south state in Arkansas. So that's usually what happens. Is even Gary Johnson, the libertarian, who was seen as was probably the most formidable libertarian candidate in American history. He went down as the election got closer. So that's probably what's going to happen. Unlike just about every system in the country, in the United States, third parties essentially dissipate, and they do not garner a lot of support. Unlike a place like Israel that's got about 39 different parties in the Knesset, for example.
Okay, one more question. Is there any chance that while the obstructionism in the House may play well to certain super conservative districts in Florida, etc., that overall might not play well and might even cost the House a majority in some soon to upcome election?
I would say almost categorically on that. Here's why. Because the members who are going to be most affected by this are not going to be the members on the far right. The only way they can lose is on their primaries. But there are 18 members who who are Republicans who represent congressional districts that Joe Biden won last time. So what does that mean? If you represent a district, for example, Dan Bacon's district, which is Nebraska, which represents college town like Omaha, college town like Lincoln, capital city like Lincoln, basically somewhat of a centrist purple district, almost center-left district. He has to go back to his constituents who are not all conservative, and they're going to say, you're part of this Republican Party. If he does vote for a Speaker of the House that's conservative, they say, you voted for that Speaker, and that's going to hurt him. He has to show his independence. Congressmen from upstate New York, for example, that just got elected, like Mike Lawler from New York State, he tries to run. If you're a Republican in a moderate district, you have to say, I'm independent-minded, and never mention that you're a Republican. Now you are associated, you are tethered, you are alligated with the most conservative elements of the Republican Party. And I'll tell you this right now, every Democrat is going to be not necessarily going to want to run against the more independent-minded Republican. They're going to want to run against whoever the Speaker of the House is, or the general zeitgeist of the Republican Party, which is seen as conservative. It reminds me a little bit of 1996. Newt Gingrich became extremely unpopular, and he was seen as a tribune of the conservative bloodline of the party. So if you remember, Peter Blue was a congressman Peter Blue was a Republican congressman, moderate, from the Worcester, Massachusetts. His opponent was Jim McGovern. And Jim McGovern ran a political ad that says, you wouldn't vote for Newt. Why would you ever vote for Blue? And it was genius, and James McGovern landed up winning, and he's still in the House of Representatives now. He's the ranking member of the Rules Committee. So I think the Democrats are actually salivating at this. The worst possible scenario for the Democrats right now is that they they actually nominate somebody who's seen as a moderate as Speaker of the House, and somebody who is unimposing, and somebody that they can't go after in the general election. They can't use as a face card of the party.
And this is a related question. It's part B, I guess. Is there any chance that flows over into the presidential aspect of the election? Does obstructionism hurt the Republicans on the presidential race side?
Not in the primary, but in the general election, absolutely. In 1996, and bring up 1996 again, Bill Clinton did not want to run against Bob Dole as much as he wanted to run against Newt Gingrich. So all the political ads he had up, it would say the Dole-Gingrich plan, to cut Social Security, the Dole-Gingrich plan to cut environmental funding, the Dole-Gingrich plan to cut Medicare. He put those two together. He tethered him, was brilliant, and he ended up winning by 8 points that time around. That's what essentially the Republican. If let's say it's not Donald Trump as a Republican nominee, let's say it's somebody who's a more moderate. Let's say it's somebody who has a more moderate face card of the Republican Party. What will the Democrats do? They're going to try to link that person to the Republican Speaker of the House, and since it's likely to be one of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives, you'll see an ad and you'll see the picture of that Speaker of the House coming up, and he's going to look disheveled, and all of a sudden you're going to say, and this person supports this person. All of a sudden they're going to try to get a picture of them together. If there's any picture of the two together, all of a sudden you're going to see someone like, let's say it's Chris Christie. You're going to see someone like Chris Christie looking at Kevin Hearn, and you're going to see if they have a picture of the two from like 2017 and a fundraiser, they're going to be right together, and you're going to see that, and it's going to be all over the country. And it's going to be plastered on just about every virtual billboard that one can think of.
All right, I got to tell you, you're really good at this. This is one of the best ones we've done, I think. And I'm really happy to see that you are getting some national gigs, right? You're getting, and I hope that some huge podcast hosts see you and ask you to be on. There's a guy named Brian Tyler Cohen who has Glenn Kirshner on that I was talking to you about.
Yeah,
he's extremely popular and good, and if you or I or both send this stuff. All it takes is a few of those, and
let's do it.
Because you're good, man.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. And I'm very comfortable working with you, so it all works out. So thank you very much.
Categorically.
Let's see your book. You got it right there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. I still don't remember. The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Trivia on Steroids. Did I get it almost correct?
You got it. Categorically correct.
Categorically correct. Okay, good. Christmas is coming. Like, it's coming down the track so fast. I and then it'll be gone. Okay, so thank you very much, Rich Rubino, and I'll speak to you again soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Bradley, again.
Okay.